People know about the notorious Atlantic slave trade. However, the chilling facts and events stay hidden forever. When schools try to wipe out the disturbing details of the Atlantic slave trade, some censored books try to give an account of the trade's tortures, atrocities, and inhumane events. Despite this, they hide what's chilling, disturbing, and regretful for many countries, including the US, Portugal, the UK, and the Netherlands. But what are we talking about? From enslaving tens of millions of blacks, torturing and whipping them, cutting their ears and body parts, giving them not more than the size of the grave in ships for the journey, and getting forced work, and events like that are kept hidden. Even in some cases, black slaves were thrown into oceans to lower the weight of the vessels. But as proof, their ears were cut so awaiting masters in Europe and America could see that their slaves were bought but had to be thrown. What more facts and events are hidden? Welcome to a new episode of Black Culture Diary, a channel where we talk about the people that are, evidently, ancestors of and superior to everyone, the black. We scrutinize history here to bring the black culture back on the surface again. In this episode, we will reveal what schools don't tell you about the Atlantic slave trade. Let's get started. The Atlantic slave trade speaks for itself, in which millions of slaves from Africa were forcefully enslaved and sent to the Americas and Europe from the early 16th century to the late 19th century. Hundreds of ships would come to Africa from Europe and the Americas and capture thousands of black Africans. Then, they were chained in small spaces on the lower decks of the ships to carry as many slaves as possible. Conditions in vessels were not so different than those of a grave, where thousands of black Africans would lie, chained to the ground so they wouldn't move. That's why 15 to 25% of black Africans died during the Atlantic slave trade that transported over 12 million black Africans. In other words, 2.75 million blacks died during horrific journeys. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain began to conquer and establish colonies in the New World, forcing the Indian people to work on their plantations. However, the violence of conquest and the introduction of European diseases led to the death of many Indian slaves, creating a labor shortage in Europe. This shortage caused Europeans to look to Africa as a solution. As Portuguese and Spanish explorers made numerous expeditions to Africa, it became a significant source of slaves for Europe, the Spanish West Indies, and Portuguese colonies in Brazil. Hence, Africans gradually replaced the Indian slaves. However, something should be known here. Before being captured by Europeans, black Africans were not born slaves. Rather, they were the same humans as the Europeans and Americans were. However, the whites strategically linked Africans with being slaves. So people in Europe and America thought that Africans were slaves back in Africa as well. But that's not the reality. Before Africans were enslaved, they were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and more. They had families and communities, and were not mere commodities. However, when Europeans took over their communities, they became captives and were forced onto large ships, transported to Europe, and dispersed across the Americas and various parts of Europe. They were subjected to inhumane living conditions, severe labor, and cruel treatment, such as whipping and physical abuse. Forced to work long hours in extreme weather and in poor health conditions, they endured unimaginable suffering. Usually, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade, we have to mention the triangular route or trade. Although Africa suffered economically, the other two parts of the triangle, which are America and Europe, greatly benefited. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on black culture, history, civilization, and natural superiority. Let's continue now. It is believed that the first voyage of African slaves to the Americas sailed in 1526. Even before this period, Europeans bought Africans as slaves, and native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers.